The MGM Grand Garden Arena was lit up like a beacon that night, its glass facade glowing against the warm Nevada evening. Banners for the Warriors United charity hung high over the entrance, flapping gently in the desert breeze. People streamed inside in a steady flow, a mix of veterans in dress uniforms, families holding small flags, and fans wearing the colors of their favorite fighters. Inside the arena pulsed with energy. Every seat was taking the hum of thousands of voices, blending into one living sound. Giant screens showed highlights of past charity events, shots of service members standing proud, and clips of the night's main attraction. Red, white, and blue lights swept over the crowd, and for a moment the noise softened as the announcer invited everyone to stand for the national anthem. When the first notes filled the air, the arena went still. Hats came off hands, went to hearts, and rows of veterans stood straight as steel. You could feel the weight of service in that room, the pride, the memories, and the loss carried quietly by the men and women in uniform. In the middle of it all, the night's headliner loomed large on the big screens. Eli Carver, known to the MMA world as the Titan, grinned into the camera. He was young, powerful, and proud, the kind of athlete who could dominate the octagon and charm a crowd in the same breath. His record was flawless, his style explosive, and his interviews full of the kind of confidence that made some people cheer and others shake their heads. Eli had earned medals overseas before he ever stepped into a cage. That was part of his draw, the decorated Army Ranger who had traded battlefields for bright lights. But he had also built a reputation for poking fun at older fighters sometimes, with a smirk that made it clear he saw the past as something to be outdone, not honored. Up in the VIP section, away from the cameras, sat a man who had lived through the kind of years Eli seemed to brush aside. Chuck Norris leaned slightly forward in his seat, his eyes on the crowd more than the stage. Next to him, Colonel Sam Dalton, his old friend from years past, sat with the posture of a man who still respected every rule of the uniform. The two men spoke in low voices, their tone calm, almost casual. Yet Sam's eyes followed Eli on the screen, with a flicker of something unspoken. Chuck stayed quiet, taking it all in the kind of quiet that was more about choosing when to speak than having nothing to say. Down on the floor, the crowd roared as Eli walked into the spotlight for an early appearance before the fights began. He waved, saluted the veterans, and delivered a short speech about the cause. It was heartfelt in parts, but then he slipped in a joke about how some of the older fighters backstage looked like they needed walkers more than gloves. The laughter was loud, but not from everyone. In the VIP section, Chuck's gaze didn't move. His face gave nothing away, but Sam noticed his jaw tighten just enough to mark the moment. Around them, the crowd's cheer swelled again as Eli flexed for the cameras, soaking in the attention like sunlight. The atmosphere was a mix of pride and excitement, the kind of electric energy you feel before a night that will be remembered. Yet beneath it, something else simmered. It was in the way some veterans exchanged glances after Eli's remark, in the way Chuck stayed still, when others clapped, in the unspoken truth that respect, once bent, doesn't spring back on its own. The lights dimmed as the first bout of the night prepared to start. Spotlights cut across the ring, music pounded, and the crowd rose to its feet again. But in the shadows of the VIP section, Chuck Norris and Colonel Dalton sat quietly, two men from another era, watching a night that might test more than just physical strength. If you'd been there, you might have felt it too. There was a sense that this was more than a fight card, that somewhere between the noise and the patriotism. An old lesson about honor and humility was waiting to be taught. The question was only when and how it would come. The semi-main event had the kind of build-up that made people lean forward in their seats. Eli Carver entered first, his walkout music pounding through the arena, his stride loose and confident. The crowd roared as he pointed to the veterans section and pumped his fist, a show of respect that seemed genuine, at least for the moment. His opponent, a Marine veteran named Travis Boone, walked in with a slower, heavier step. He was older, with scars on his face, and the kind of calm that comes from having seen things most people never will. The cheers for him were warm, filled with a quieter kind of admiration that didn't need flashing lights. From the start, the fight was one-sided. Carver's speed was on another level, his footwork crisp, his strikes sharp. He ducked under Boone's punches, with ease, slipped inside, and landed combinations that made the crowd gasp. Boone kept pressing forward, taking hits, refusing to back down, but each exchange pushed him closer to the edge. By the second round, it was clear the end was near. Carver dropped Boone with a clean right hand and pounced, forcing the referee to step in. The official waved it off, and Boone stayed down on one knee for a moment, breathing hard, staring at a canvas, before standing up. The crowd applauded him, some for his toughness, others out of respect for his service. Carver didn't wait for his opponent to leave the cage before celebrating. He leapt onto the fence, shouting to the crowd, pumping his arms like a conquering hero. Cameras followed him as he mimed wiping sweat off his brow, then pretended to hunch over with stiff steps, getting a laugh from some sections of the arena. The joke was obvious. Boone's age, his slower reflexes, his inability to keep up with the young star. Some people cheered, but you could feel the shift in the air, a ripple of unease moving through those who saw more insult than entertainment in it. Carver kept the act going, holding an imaginary cane, pretending to lean on it before tossing it away, and shadowboxing. The announcers tried to laugh along, but their voices had that edge of discomfort, like they knew the moment was crossing a line. Boone stood in his corner silent, his eyes fixed on the mat. Then Carver's gaze wandered to the VIP section. His smile changed sharper, now the kind that comes when someone spots an easy target. His eyes locked on Chuck Norris. The cameras caught it, instantly flashing his image onto the big screens. Carver pointed at him and raised his voice so the crowd could hear over the noise. Something about how even legends get old. How the next generation is here to stay. How might it be time for some people to stick to telling stories instead of living them? The arena reacted like a wave breaking. Gasps, laughter, murmurs, and the buzz of whispers running from row to row. Heads turned toward the VIP section. Phones went up, recording waiting. Chuck didn't move. He sat with the same steady posture, hands resting on his knees, eyes on Carver. His face was unreadable, neither smiling nor frowning, just watching, like a man deciding whether something deserved an answer. Colonel Dalton glanced at him, then back to the cage, the faintest shake of his head, as if to say, the moment would come in its own time. Around them, the tension coiled tight, the crowd caught between the thrill of the fight and the sting of what had just been said. Carver soaked it in, pacing the cage with a grin, nodding like he'd just claimed another victory. But some of the applause was already fading, replaced by a low murmur that had nothing to do with the scorecards. It was the sound of people waiting, wondering if the man in the VIP seat would let that pass. And in that charged moment, it was clear. The fight everyone had come to see was no longer the one happening inside the cage. It was the one that hadn't started yet. Eli Carver was still pacing inside the cage, the roar of the crowd rolling over him like waves. Sweat dripped from his brow. His chest rose and fell with the deep, satisfied breaths of a man who had just put on a show. The ring announcer tried to close the segment, but Carver shook his head and motioned for the microphone. The crowd noise shifted, curious, expectant. Carver took the mic with a grin that showed he was not done. He spoke about the cause, about the veterans, about his victory, then paused and turned toward the VIP section again. You could feel the change in the air when he pointed up at Chuck Norris. The words came sharp, almost playful, but the meaning cut deep. He dared Chuck to step into the cage to show if the old legends still had what it took against the best of the new generation. At first, there was a ripple of laughter. Then the chants started. Chuck, Chuck, Chuck. The sound built fast, bouncing off the arena walls, rolling down from the upper seats, until the whole place was on its feet. Carver played it up, cupping his ear, nodding like he was giving the people what they wanted. In the VIP section, Colonel Sam Dalton leaned toward Chuck, his voice low and steady. He reminded him there was no need to take the bait, and that a man's worth was not proven by answering every call. Chuck kept his eyes on the cage, his hands resting calmly on his knees. Carver leaned on the cage wall, closest to the VIP section, shouting above the noise. He talked about proving himself against the greatest. He hinted that maybe the legends were only legends because no one had tested them lately. The crowd's roar swelled again, the chants coming in hard bursts now. Phones lit up like fireflies, recording every angle. The camera crews closed in on Chuck's face, searching for a reaction. But he gave them nothing. No smile. No frown. Only that same steady gaze, like a man weighing something far more important than the show unfolding in front of him. Dalton glanced at the cameras, then back at Chuck. He repeated himself softer this time, saying there was nothing to prove. Chuck's eyes never left Carver. It was impossible to tell if he was annoyed, amused, or simply patient. By now, the arena was alive in a way that no scheduled fight could match. The chants had a rhythm to them, a heartbeat that seemed to thump in the chest of every person in the building. Even people who had come for the other fights were leaning toward this moment, pulled into the possibility of what might happen. Carver raised his arms and turned in a slow circle feeding on the noise. Then he pointed one last time at Chuck and called him out again, louder, clearer, with the kind of finality that left the whole place hanging on the next move. Chuck did not stand. He did not wave. He just sat there, still as a statue, while the chants pounded the air like a drum. The cameras stayed locked on him, the entire arena, holding its breath, waiting for the smallest sign of an answer. The noise reached a fever pitch. Carver grinned like he had already won something. Dalton sat back in his chair, his jaw tight. And Chuck, without moving a muscle, let the moment hang there, heavy enough to make everyone wonder if the silence itself was the start of something they would never forget. For a long moment, Chuck Norris did not move. The chants of his name rolled through the MGM Grand like thunder, each wave louder than the last. Then, without a word, he placed his hands on the arms of his seat and rose. It was a small movement, but it hit the arena like a spark in dry grass. The noise surged, then dipped into a strange, tight hush, as if thousands of people were suddenly holding their breath. Chuck adjusted the cuffs of his jacket with slow, precise care, his eyes never leaving the cage. Colonel Dalton watched him with a look halfway between pride and warning. Chuck gave him a small nod, the kind that carried more meaning than a whole sentence. Then he started forward his pace, unhurried, each step deliberate. The floor seemed to part for him without anyone asking. Security moved aside. Fans stepped back, phones in the air, their voices dropping as if the weight of the moment demanded quiet. Even the music from the sound system faded the noise, replaced by the heavy thump of bass in the crowd's chest. In the cage, Eli Carver leaned on a fence, grinning, calling out something about taking his time. His voice was lighter now, the tone just a little too loud, like a man trying to convince himself as much as the crowd. He flexed for the cameras, but his eyes kept darting to Chuck's steady approach. Chuck's steps were measured, his shoulders square, his gaze fixed straight ahead. There was no swagger, no performance, only the calm certainty of a man who had walked into far more dangerous places than this. Every few steps, a fan reached out a hand, and though he didn't break stride, he acknowledged them with the smallest nod. The closer he got, the quieter the arena became. It was not the silence of disinterest. It was the kind of stillness that comes when people realize they might be watching something they will talk about for years. The sound of his shoes on the floor seemed to echo, carrying all the way to the rafters. Carver tried to keep it light, clapping his hands and telling the crowd this was going to be fun. But the smirk on his face was tighter now, the words landing weaker, without the same swell of cheers behind them. The cameras caught a flicker in his eyes, quick but telling, as Chuck reached the edge of the cage. Chuck stopped just short of the steps, his hands resting at his sides. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He just looked up at Carver, letting the space between them fill with a tension so thick you could almost hear it hum. Somewhere high in the stands, a voice shouted his name, and the chant began again, slow and deep, pulling everyone into its rhythm. Chuck, Chuck, Chuck. Carver lifted the mic again, trying to meet the moment with more bravado, but the laughter that followed was thinner, now scattered. Chuck finally placed one foot on a first step to the cage. The crowd drew in a sharp breath, the sound like wind before a storm. Carver stepped back without meaning to, just a half step, but the cameras caught it, and the crowd noticed. Chuck Norris placed his hand on the top of the cage and stepped inside, as if he had done it 1,000 times before. The metal under his shoes gave a faint creak, a small sound lost in the rush of the crowd's breath. Carver stood across from him, his smile frozen, and the microphone was now lowered to his side. Chuck walked to the center without hurry. He unbuttoned his jacket and slid it off, folding it once before handing it to a waiting official. Then he reached for his watch, a simple worn piece of steel, and placed it carefully on top of the jacket, as if setting it down in his own home. The crowd reacted in waves. First came the cheers, loud and wild. Then came the hush, like people realizing they needed to hear every sound. Somewhere near the front row, a fan whispered that it was about to happen, and the whisper spread like a current through water. The referee shifted his weight, glancing toward Colonel Dalton at ringside. Dalton met his eyes and gave the smallest nod, nothing more. It was enough. Carver tried to break the stillness with a laugh, but the sound felt out of place now. He bounced on his toes, shadowboxing a little, but his eyes never left Chuck's face. It was as if he were searching for some hint of what the older man was thinking. Chuck gave him nothing. He simply rolled his shoulders once, loosening them, his gaze steady and unblinking. His hands hung loose, the kind of loose that comes from knowing exactly when to strike. The cameras closed in on his face, broadcasting it on the big screens overhead. In that magnified stillness, the lines of age were not weakness, but proof. Proof of years earned, of battles fought, of lessons learned that no one could buy. The cage seemed smaller now, the space between the two men closing without either one moving. The crowd's silence was not absente. It was a weight pressing down on everyone, making the air feel thicker. Dalton leaned back in his chair, his expression calm, but his eyes alive. He knew Chuck had already answered the challenge, not with words, not with a show, but with the simple act of being there ready. Carver lifted his chin, trying to keep the grin in place, but it faltered for just a heartbeat. He stepped forward, meeting Chuck in the center. And for that moment, with no words spoken, the younger man understood that the game had shifted. The audience felt it too. Every person in that arena knew they were not watching a stunt or a publicity trick. They were watching the start of something real, something that did not need a single line of dialogue to be understood. The referee stepped back and motioned for them to begin. Carver wasted no time. He lunged forward with a sharp jab, followed by a snapping right cross, the kind of combination designed to set the tone early. Chuck did not step back. He turned his shoulders just enough for the first punch to pass, then dipped his head a fraction so the cross slid by without touching him. His eyes stayed locked on Carver, reading the rhythm of the younger man's movement. Carver came again faster this time. A flurry of hooks and uppercuts, each one thrown with power and speed. The crowd cheered at the pace, watching the young fighter explode forward with everything he had. Chuck shifted only when he needed to. A small lean here, a step to the side there. Every motion was clean, controlled, wasting nothing. It was as if he was not avoiding punches, but allowing them to miss. Carver circled throwing kicks, now testing high and low. Chuck's stance barely changed. When a roundhouse came high, he tilted his head and let it pass close enough to move the air near his cheek. When a low kick swept toward his leg, he lifted his foot, as if stepping over a small puddle. The difference between them was becoming clear to anyone watching closely. Carver's speed was dazzling, his power real. But every strike carried effort, and every burst of motion cost him something. Chuck's movements were so small, they seemed effortless. His breathing steady, his eyes never breaking focus. Carver tried to crowd him, forcing the pace, aiming a spinning back fist at the side of Chuck's head. Chuck leaned back, letting it miss by inches, his expression unchanged. The crowd reacted as much to the calm as to the dodge, a ripple of admiration running through the seats. The younger man began talking between strikes, trying to provoke a reaction. Chuck didn't answer. He simply watched his feet, moving just enough to stay where he wanted to be. It was the kind of control that could not be faked, and the longer it went on, the more the arena noticed. Carver threw a rapid 5-punch combination, each strike meant to find a gap. Chuck let them come, slipping the first, parrying the second, letting the third graze his sleeve, then stepping inside the last two, so they never reached him. His timing made it look like he knew the sequence before it started. By now, some of the cheers for Carver had turned to murmurs. People were beginning to understand what they were seeing. This was not a contest of youth against age. It was speed against foresight, power against precision. Carver stepped back, breathing heavier, shaking his arms loose before charging in again. Chuck waited, feet planted, eyes locked in. As the first punch came, he pivoted just enough to let it sail past, and Carver had to turn with it to keep from overbalancing. Every exchange told the same story. Carver's attacks were fierce, but Chuck's responses were rooted in patience. He never chased, never overreached. He let the younger man burn energy, each missed, strike a small victory of its own. The crowd was leaning in now, following every twitch, every shift in balance. The difference in pace between the two fighters had become part of the tension. Carver moved like a storm. Chuck moved like the tide. With each passing second, it became harder for Carver to hide his frustration. His swings grew wider, his steps heavier. Chuck's posture stayed the same. Shoulders relaxed, hands ready, but not eager. He was not there to prove speed. He was there to prove control. And though not a single strike had landed from him, yet it was already clear to many in the arena who was in command. The silence between the bursts of noise was full of something deeper than excitement. It was respect slowly shifting in the direction of the man who had not thrown a single punch. It was only a walk, just a man moving from one place to another. But in that arena, in that moment, it felt like history was taking shape with every step Chuck Norris took toward the octagon. And no one, not even Eli Carver, could make it feel like anything less. Carver's strikes kept coming, but there was a change now. The precision from earlier had given way to something tighter, sharper in a different way. He was chasing his footwork, more aggressive, his shoulders tense. Chuck moved the same as before, never more than he had to. A slip of the head, a sidestep so small it barely registered until the punch missed. His breathing was steady, his eyes locked on Carver, as if he could see the moment each strike was born. The younger man's voice had gone quiet. The smirks and quick comments were gone. Every miss seemed to feed a growing need to land something, anything that would turn the tide. But the more he pressed, the more it was clear the pace belonged to someone else. Then it happened. As Carver charged in with a looping right, Chuck stepped in instead of away. He lifted his hand and placed an open palm flat against Carver's chest, stopping his forward motion with nothing more than timing and placement. It was not a strike. It was not meant to hurt. But it landed with the weight of a message, one Carver felt in the sudden halt of his own momentum. The crowd reacted with a wave of sound, not the roar for a knockout, but the kind of cheer that comes when people see something they have never quite witnessed before. They understood it instantly. Chuck had touched him for the first time, not to score, but to show. Carver stepped back, blinking as if unsure how it had even happened. His fists stayed up, but his stance shifted a little wider, his guard just a bit higher. For the first time, he was not only attacking, he was thinking about what might come back. Chuck stayed still, his hands loose at his sides. The only movement was a slight turn of his shoulders, an invitation without words. Carver circled, looking for an opening, but now there was hesitation in his steps. The audience felt the change. They were no longer watching to see if Chuck could handle the speed. They were watching to see how he would dictate it. Every time Carver feinted, Chuck reacted only enough to keep the space exactly where he wanted it. Another rush came faster and harder, a series of hooks and a knee to the body. Chuck turned his hips to absorb the angle, letting the strikes pass or fall short, then placed his palm on Carver's shoulder and guided him off balance. Again, not a hit, just control. The crowd's energy shifted from the raw noise of a fight to the hum of understanding. People leaned forward in their seats, catching the rhythm, seeing the space between attacks, and how Chuck was filling it without force. Carver's frustration was now in every movement. His shoulders rose with his breath. His swings carried more weight than precision. He was trying to break through a wall that was not made of strength, but of timing. Chuck gave him nothing easy. He did not chase. He did not rush. He simply remained where the fight came to him, answering each burst of aggression with a redirection so calm it almost looked casual. When the next palm touched Carver's chest, the reaction was instant. A loud, knowing cheer rolled through the arena. They had seen enough to understand. This was not about avoiding the fight. It was about showing who decided when and where the fight happened. And in that moment, the man who had not thrown a single traditional punch was the one in complete command. Carver's shoulders dropped a little as he circled again, but this time it was not from fatigue alone. The wild swings had stopped. The sharp smirk was gone. His eyes stayed fixed on Chuck with a steadiness that had not been there before. When he moved in, it was measured. A quick jab to test the distance, then a step back to reset his stance. His breathing slowed his guard tighter, his feet lighter on the canvas. Chuck read the change instantly. He shifted with him no longer, only evading, but meeting him in the center with small, purposeful movements. His hands came up just enough to show he was now engaging on the same level as Carver had chosen. The first real exchange landed clean for both. Carver's left hook brushed Chuck's ribs, while Chuck's counter touched his jaw with the edge of a knuckle. It was light, precise, and deliberate. The crowd's reaction was different now. The cheers carried less of the rowdy edge and more of the sound that comes when people know they are watching something meaningful. They were seeing a fight turn into an understanding. Carver nodded once, almost to himself, and came forward again. His strikes were sharper, but his balance stayed under control. When Chuck slipped a punch, Carver was already back in position instead of stumbling forward. Chuck responded in kind, stepping in with short, efficient combinations. Nothing wild, nothing wasted. A jab that found its mark, a low kick that tapped Carver's thigh just enough to make him shift his weight. Each time they touched gloves, in the flow of motion, there was no anger in it. It was an exchange of skill, the kind where both men understood the other's language without saying a word. The earlier mockery was gone. In its place was something closer to respect. Carver began to adjust his timing, looking for angles instead of rushing head-on. He moved with more patience, and when he missed, he did not follow with reckless swings. He reset, ready for what came back. Chuck gave him more to work with, now letting the distance close, offering openings that disappeared the moment Carver tried to take them. It was not a trap, but a test. And each time Carver reacted with discipline, Chuck matched it with a nod or a faint shift of stance. The audience could feel it as clearly as they could see it. The air in the MGM Grand was charged not with the tension of insult, but with the quiet electricity of mutual recognition. In the middle of the cage, two fighters of different generations moved in a rhythm that felt almost like a conversation. Carver's breathing was steady again. Chuck's eyes carried no hint of condescension. Every step, every strike, spoke to the same truth. This was no longer about proving who was faster, stronger, or tougher. It was about meeting each other on the ground where respect lives. And though no one in the arena could say exactly when it happened, they knew the fight had already changed both men. Carver took the microphone slowly, his chest still rising and falling from the effort. The arena was quieter than it had been all night, the kind of quiet that waits for something worth hearing. He glanced once at Chuck, then out at the crowd, his voice steady, but softer than before. He admitted that when he first saw Chuck sitting in the VIP section, he thought it would be easy to make him a target. He said the plan was to get a laugh, to show that the new guard had taken over, and to prove himself by embarrassing a legend. But as he spoke, his tone shifted, and his words carried none of the edge from earlier in the night. Carver told the crowd that he had learned something in the cage that no highlight reel could teach. He spoke about how he had thrown his best shots and never once broken through, not because Chuck was faster or stronger, but because he was patient. He said that what he had mistaken for age was actually mastery. The crowd began to respond with a low hum of approval, the sound building slowly. Carver looked down for a moment, then back up his eyes, scanning the stands. He said that real strength was not defined by who could yell the loudest or hit the hardest. It was defined by who could stay in control when every instinct told them to lash out. He admitted that discipline was something he had never truly respected until tonight. He told them that he had come into the fight thinking that winning was about dominance, but now he understood that it was about composure. His voice stayed even, not pleading for forgiveness, but speaking with the weight of someone who had been changed. The applause grew louder, not wild, but steady and full. It was the kind of applause that came from respect, not excitement. People were not cheering for the fight anymore. They were cheering for the moment. Carver turned once more to Chuck, holding the microphone at his side. He said nothing, then letting the space between them carry the rest of the message. Chuck nodded once in return, and the arena seemed to draw in a single breath together before breaking into one last round of applause. It was not the ending most had expected. It was better. It was the kind that left the crowd walking out into the night with something to think about, carrying a quiet story they would tell again and again. And somewhere in that, Carver's words would be remembered for what they were: a lesson learned in public. Backstage, the noise of the arena was only a faint hum through the concrete walls. The air smelled faintly of sweat and disinfectant, the sharp edge of competition replaced by a calmer stillness. Carver sat on a folding chair, his gloves off his hands, resting on his knees. Chuck stepped into the room without ceremony. No entourage, no cameras, just the sound of his boots on the floor and the steady presence that had carried through the entire night. Carver stood as he approached, unsure whether to speak first. Chuck reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a plain white business card. There was no logo, no design, just a phone number printed in the center. He held it out, and Carver took it with both hands, glancing down before meeting his eyes again. The older man's voice was quiet, steady. He said that the loudest man in the room is rarely the strongest. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything that had happened in the cage. Carver nodded his grip, tightening slightly on the card. There was no defense in his eyes, now only the kind of focus that comes when a lesson has settled in deep. He said nothing, but the way he held the card told Chuck he understood. They stood there for a moment longer, no rush to break the silence. The handshake that followed was firm, not for show, but as a seal between teacher and student. Chuck gave a final nod and turned toward the hallway, his steps as unhurried as they had been walking to the cage. Carver watched him go, slipping the card into his pocket. He knew he would keep it, not as a contact, but as a reminder. Some lessons were meant to be taught in front of thousands. Others were best given in a quiet room, where only two people would ever know the full weight of what was said. Weeks later, the sound in the dojo was nothing like the roar of an arena. It was the quiet slap of bare feet on the mat, the sharp exhale of controlled strikes, and the soft creak of the wooden floor when students bowed. Carver stood among them, dressed in a plain white guy, his black belt from the fight world replaced by a beginner's white. He moved without the flash that had once defined him. No spinning kicks, no exaggerated feints, just steady footwork and simple, precise strikes, repeating each drill until his shoulders ached and sweat ran into his eyes. When Chuck corrected his stance, Carver listened, nodded, and adjusted without question. The other students ranged from teenagers to retirees, some veterans, some not. Carver worked beside them like any other, waiting his turn for drills, bowing to each partner before they began. There was no sign of the man who once played to the cameras, only the focus of someone intent on building from the ground up. One afternoon, after class, Chuck had him lead a group through basic forms. His voice was even, his instructions clear, and he never once mentioned who he was or what he had done. The only thing that mattered in that room was the practice. Outside the dojo, Carver had begun speaking at veterans events. His first time on stage was in a community hall in Dallas, the crowd small but attentive. He told them about the night in Las Vegas, how he had walked in thinking strength meant making someone else look weak, and how that belief had been stripped away in minutes. He spoke about control, not as a way to win fights, but as a way to live. He said discipline was not a cage, but a foundation. The people who carried themselves with quiet confidence were the ones who left the deepest mark. The veterans listened closely, some nodding, some smiling faintly. They understood the lesson without needing to hear every detail. When Carver finished, the applause was warm, not because he had given a speech, but because they recognized the truth in it. Back in the dojo, the training continued. Day after day, Carver showed up early, stayed late, and left with the same quiet bow. His hands grew sharper, his stance more solid, but what changed most was his presence. The urgency to prove himself was gone. In its place was the steady rhythm of a man learning that mastery was not a finish line, but a path he could walk for the rest of his life. The first clips hit social media before most people had even left the MGM Grand parking lot. Short videos from phone cameras showed the moment Chuck stepped into the cage, the open palm to Carver's forehead, and the quiet nod that ended it all. Within hours, the footage had been cut slowed and replayed with captions about patience, respect, and knowing when enough is enough. By the next morning, it had spread to news outlets. Sports shows ran it alongside analysis, but most of the coverage was not about technique or scorecards. The conversation centered on the way Chuck controlled the moment without aggression, and how Carver's change in demeanor had been as telling as any blow landed. Veterans groups began sharing the video with their own commentary. Some wrote about how the exchange reminded them of lessons learned in service, where composure under pressure mattered more than force. Others spoke about mentors who had guided them the same way Chuck had guided Carver, with presence instead of volume. Martial artists from different disciplines weighed in too. In online forums, they pointed out how rare it was to see control used so cleanly in a public setting, especially when the crowd was hungry for action. Many admitted that it made them think differently about their own training and the value of knowing when not to strike. Clips of Carver's post-fight speech began circulating alongside the fight footage. His words about discipline being stronger than dominance were quoted in articles reposted in motivational threads and even played on morning radio shows. People who had never watched an MMA match before were sharing it because the message reached beyond the sport. Some of the most powerful reactions came from quiet corners. A retired Marine wrote on a veteran's blog that he had watched the clip 5 times in a row, not for the fight, but for the look on Carver's face when he understood. A high school wrestling coach posted that he showed it to his team, telling them this was what it meant to have control over yourself. Even in the noisy space of online debate, the tone was different. There were no endless arguments about who would have won under different rules. Instead, the comment sections fair-illed with personal stories, each one echoing the same theme. People remembered the moments in their own lives when someone had stopped them in their tracks without raising their voice. By the end of the week, the clip had been watched millions of times. But the numbers were not the point. The point was that the conversation had shifted from a single night in Las Vegas to a broader talk about what strength really means. And in that way, the lesson Chuck had given Carver in silence had spoken loudly to more people than either of them could have imagined. The letter came in a plain, white envelope, tucked in with the day's mail at the Texas dojo. The handwriting was careful, the kind that takes extra time to get right. Chuck set it aside until the room was quiet, then opened it at his desk. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper. It was from a 13-year-old karate student named Daniel. He wrote that he had seen the viral clip of the open hand to Carver's forehead and had watched it over and over. Daniel said he used to think winning meant hitting harder and faster than anyone else. But after seeing that moment, he realized that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stop before you have to prove anything. He said he wanted to train, not just to fight, but to have the same control and respect he had seen in that cage. Chuck read the words slowly, his eyes moving over the uneven lines. He could picture the boy sitting at a kitchen table somewhere, leaning over the paper with a pen, trying to make each sentence count. There was a sincerity in the letter that could not be faked. He leaned back in his chair and let the paper rest in his hand. Outside, he could hear the sound of students finishing their drills, the rhythm of their movement, steady and familiar. He thought about how the lesson that night had been for Carver, but how it had reached someone far younger, hundreds of miles away. That was the part most people never saw. The way a single act done without thinking about cameras or applause could ripple outward and land somewhere you would never expect. The kind of influence that could last longer than any highlight reel. Chuck folded the letter carefully and placed it in the top drawer of his desk. There was no need to reply right away. Sometimes, knowing the message had landed was enough. He sat for a moment longer, the quiet of the dojo wrapping around him. He felt no pride in the sense of accomplishment. It was something simpler, a quiet satisfaction that the values he had lived by were not just remembered, but carried forward. And in that stillness, he knew this was the real legacy. Not the titles, not the fights, but the moments that would outlive him in the hands of the next generation. The sun had only just cleared the horizon when Chuck stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of mesquite and fresh earth. The fields around the ranch were quiet, except for the low murmur of cattle somewhere beyond the fence line. He moved across the yard to a flat patch of grass he had worn smooth over the years. His bare feet pressed into the ground as he began his warm-up, each stretch and roll of the shoulders done with unhurried care. The first rays of sunlight touched the edges of the barn, turning the weathered boards a deep gold. His forms began slowly. Every movement was deliberate, his breathing steady, his gaze fixed not on anything in particular, but on the space in front of him. A low front, kick a smooth pivot, the soft thud of a heel, setting back on the earth. The rhythm was familiar, the kind that settled into the bones after decades of practice. There was no audience here. No lights, no cameras, no roar of a crowd. only the sound of the wind brushing through the tall grass and the steady cadence of his breath. This was the part of training that no one ever asked about yet. It was the part that mattered most. As he flowed from one form to the next, his mind drifted to Las Vegas, not to the noise or the spectacle, but to the look in Carver's eyes after the open hand touched his forehead. It was the same look he had seen in students when something finally clicked, when they understood that control could be stronger than force. He thought about how many people had seen that moment, and how most of them would never step into a ring or a dojo. But the lesson was not about fighting. It was about carrying yourself in a way that did not need to prove anything. That was something anyone could learn if they were willing to listen. He shifted into a low stance, his body sinking smoothly, arms extended, with the kind of balance that came only from time. The morning light caught the dust rising from his steps, turning it into a faint shimmer before it vanished in the breeze. By the time he finished, the sun was high enough to warm the ground beneath his feet. He bowed toward the open field, not to anyone watching, but as a habit of gratitude. Then he turned toward the house, ready to start the rest of his day. The world beyond the ranch would keep moving with its noise and pace. But here, in the quiet, the lessons stayed clear. Discipline, patience, the strength to choose stillness over the need to win every moment. And for Chuck, that was the kind of victory that never faded.